So in this video, I want to explore loneliness, and I'll begin by including you in some of the meta conversation around this topic. So on the way to an errand this morning, I got this image for a book, which when I arrived, I took the time to kind of write out some notes. And then, I've been listening to Tim Ferriss and Tony Robbins today, and I think loneliness is a really important topic to examine because I've heard some people say that loneliness and the fear of loneliness is not being alone, but loneliness is the greatest human fear. And it can be such a powerful and potent experience that Aboriginal tribes in some cultures, simply by refusing to acknowledge the existence of one of their tribe members, literally induced a loneliness and a lack of desire to live that was so great that, fully grown, healthy tribe members would curl up into a fetal position and starve themselves rather than exist in a community in that state of belonging in which no one wanted them to be there, number one, and no one acknowledged their existence. So loneliness is a powerful and potent emotional state. And the meta conversation around this is always, when to dwell on what we would call negativity or pain and something that's not pleasant, when to focus on the positive, when to look on the bright side, and when to examine things. And of course, I don't know the answer to this, but what I do know is that that we have a physical body, we have a mental body, we have an emotional body. Now, the physical body we can see, and as a very materialistic culture, we know the most about our physical body. And so, in the analogy of medicine, to ignore a wound, let's say you get an infection and you say, let's be positive, and you don't root out the infection, you don't treat it with antibiotics, it spreads, it grows, and you can die simply by trying to be positive. If you have an amputation in your leg, you're run over by a train or whatever, your leg is off, it's bleeding, and you say, don't worry about it, that's just, no big deal. Isn't it great that isn't it great that trains are here in the last 200 years, and before that we didn't have trains, and then 20 minutes later you're dead. And so I think that whereas a couple of maybe 100 years ago, particularly men, would be getting an infection and whatever, and it would be shameful to go to the doctor. It'd be shameful to go to the doctor, and it would be shameful to ask for help. And so there would be this kind of social thing where it was the man's job to say, oh, it's nothing. And it was their friends and a woman's job to say, no, 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 you've got to go to the doctor. Oh, all right. And oh, you got there just in the nick of time and saved him. So this was the little social dance. But on a purely technical term, if you care about people around you, if you care about friends and family, of course, man or woman, getting yourself to a hospital, to a doctor when you are physically sick and in danger is amongst the most responsible, kind, pragmatic, masculine things you can do, because even within that, that little stereotypical box of men and chauvinism and the like, you are not going to make all that money, win all those football games, etc., if you are dead or sick. And I think that what we're moving through is that's now relatively accepted. So, so we've gone from it's shameful to ask for help and admit impact, particularly for a man, mentally, emotionally, and physically, to now we're in a little bit saner state. In 2017, when I'm making this video, where most men are not ashamed to seek medical help for, a major physical issue. There's still shame around. If you can possibly get away with it, say that it's nothing. But there's a lot of shame around mental, emotional wounds. There's that same thing. Real men, don't have pain, don't have fear. If they do, they get over it, they push through it. And yet, the hypothesis that makes the most sense to me is that the mind, the heart, the mind, the heart, the body, in all their kind of neurological and physiological connections, which are quite strong. Emotions can generally be located to a point in the body that is actually allowing our consciousness to feel that and be conscious of that state. Emotions are often generated by thoughts, i.e., I may be losing my job. How am I going to support my family? Alertness, concern. I don't know. Helplessness. I'm such a failure because I can't. Shame and despair. Now, that's three waves of thought, creating three waves of feelings. And neurologists and physical scientists can track those chemicals right in the body. And they can be deadly. Despair, loneliness, depression, they can kill your body faster than tobacco or alcohol or a motorcycle statistics. So it's important. And, in that light, my balance is more around how much do I want to focus on the negative. So to kind of go into that kind of optimal paradigm, I think if we look at the optimal paradigm for physical health, it can give us clues into how to relate to the optimal paradigm for mental emotional health. Knowing they're all related, one, and also that they're echoes. Well, our physical eyes don't see all of that chemistry going on because they're looking out, and just a depressing thought or a real concern or a negative message from the media is changing the body on the inside, is changing our outlook on possibilities on the inside versus on the outside. It's just as impactful, sometimes more. I mean, I can't tell you the number of perfectly beautiful, healthy bodies that are in a reality of very wide physical possibility. Like there's no abuser in the space or on the horizon right then. They have enough money. They can think. They've got free time. And yet a damaged mental, emotional body will obscure all of that potential. And so the body is completely useless. Whereas you take someone else with confidence, with clarity in that mental, emotional terrain, and they can be in a wheelchair, and in a few days they'll make $1 million. In a few days they will, be the life of the party. They're not physically, emotionally wounded. And so if we can lift off the stigma and then learn from what we've learned in terms of optimal physical health. So number one, you've got to know what your disease is. And where on a physical level, I mean, there's thousands of viruses and food poisoning and this and that, and it's really complicated. Whereas on the one hand, it's hard because you don't see your emotions with your five senses, but you feel them. And so the kind of handicap of them being, in a sense, invisible, I think is balanced out by they're a little bit more obvious. In other words, to look at where the emotional wound is you can just do a little chart. Like I would say that, when you're in a state of healthy well-being, you're confident, you like yourself, you're curious and interested in others, you feel safe enough in here. And this is how you can tell a really safe person, that someone who's feeling really secure and good about themselves, it's all about you. They're interested in you. How are you feeling? How does this work? How does that work? They're interested in what's outside of them. And in a very intelligent way, when they're sick, particularly if they're in trauma and feel like there's a threat on the inside, there's a wound, they are very appropriately self-centered. So you can kind of get a sense of how healthy the mental, emotional body of a given person is by how self-centered they are. You just take it into the physical example, where if you're curious, you're interested, you're looking at that girl, you're looking at that, that guy, you're out there, and then someone slices your finger off. In other words, causes just a very small wound. One finger, one bit of it, off. You are no longer aware of anything else but you. I've got to get to the hospital. What's going on? I'm in pain. I'm in pain. So it becomes completely self-absorbed. And this is healthy. This is healthy. To completely ignore, a bleeding finger that could get infected and, the loss, not sewing it back on and rushing to the emergency is absurd. It's not doing anyone any favors. It's certainly not doing you any favors. So to the degree that we are in danger, that we are wounded mentally, emotionally, physically, we're self-centered. To the degree that we are safe and comfortable and clear and confident in our safety, we're other people-centered. And you can see that goes to the next level when people really feel and get their abundance. Like, I've got a lot of energy, I've got a lot of emotional bandwidth, I'm right, I've got lots of flexibility, I'm centered, I'm strong, I've got a good mind, I've got no financial issues, I've got my stuff covered. And you see someone in pain, you want to help them. It's just human nature. You feel what's going on over there, you see what you can do to help. Now, when you're poor, when you feel like you don't have enough, there's not enough time, there's not enough sleep, and then you run into the same situation, it's like, I can't deal with it, I got to focus on me. And to some degree, that's healthy, but this is why I believe that healing our own mental, emotional body, as well as our physical body, is actually the greatest gift we can give to the world. Because it is simply not consistent with the data to try and be this great person with others when we're bleeding on our physical body, our mental body, our emotional body, and often they're all three linked in together. So what is the great paradigm in the physical body? You want to know what the disease is. Emotionally, it's what is dis-ease. So pain, fear, loneliness, anxiety, dread, humiliation, shame, big one. Trauma and overwhelm, a feeling that's so big we can't face it, whatever it is. It's like, oh gosh, I just can't go there. Overwhelm. Depression, grief, diseases. They're not bad, not good and wrong. They're diseases. They're a state of disease. So you just calculate how much joy, love, enthusiasm, gratitude, happiness, wonder am I in today? How much depression, loneliness, whatever. So this is on loneliness, and it's a pretty, we all know what loneliness feels like, and the degree to which we're lonely is hurting our body, hurting our immune system, and pulling our mind away from creative possibilities to contribute towards depressing thoughts. I'm not, I'm alone because I'm not good enough. What do I need to fix? I'm a bad person. These things, and these, if you look at a physical thing, so number one, the diagnosis. You've got to know what's out there, what's dangerous. It's like take the sexual scene. You got to know what STDs are out there. You got to know what the symptoms are. And you got to know which ones are really deadly. It's like, chlamydia, you can clear it up with an antibiotic in 2 weeks. Syphilis, if you can clear that up with, some penicillin. HIV, that's, you can go a while, but that's a pretty serious one. So you want to know, do you have that? Can I catch it? Where you want to know what the biggies are. And loneliness is one of those biggies. And you want to know, if you recall the stupidity and the ignorance in the 80s of, Reagan dismissing it and letting AIDS spread into the population because no one knew what it was. No one knew what the threat was, and no one knew for sure how to protect themselves from it. This is the perfect environment for it to spread. And, the ignorance of thinking it's a gay disease, etc., it's everyone's disease. Now, the same is true with emotions. So it doesn't look like ignoring the threat is a big, is intelligent. Number two, you got to know the environment that creates the disease. So it's low immunity. It's, so not getting enough sleep. It's having too much stress. It's being lonely. It's, having despair. All these things that bring your chemicals down. And then unsafe sex and not optimal hygiene and all of this. So every one of these environments, and then you add in chemical loads and alcohol and various things like that that further, weaken the body's ability to protect itself. You got to know the environment in which a disease is most capable of entering you. And some of the statistics say, for example, that, in terms of HIV, that if you're really healthy, there's only like a 1 in 300% chance that two people in reasonable health, taking care of each other, having vaginal intercourse, will actually transmit HIV and yet if in anal sex it's much higher, and if you're and if you have vaginal sex without a condom, and you're in really bad shape, the odds go up. So it's important to know the environment. It's important to take action, not dwell on the disease. In other words, oh my God, I might get AIDS. Oh my God, I might get AIDS. Oh my God, I might get AIDS. Da, 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 da. That lowers the immune system. That doesn't help at all. That is counterproductive. But these are the areas I could get AIDS. These are the statistics in this country, in this country, in this segment of the population, in this segment of the population. This is how many prostitutes have it. This is how many men have it. This is how many women have it. This is the really dangerous terrain. And then these are the cycles of my life. Like right after vacation, when I'm really healthy and all that, risks are a little lower. After a really difficult slog at work and a death in the family and alcohol abuse and all that, the diseases are up. So you want to know what you're dealing with as a probability field. And then you want to do everything you can to minimize that, number one. Two, you want to get regular checkups. You want to look in there and say, nobody wants to hear they've got a disease. But if I've done anything, remotely risky, meaning in other words, if I've had unprotected sex with anyone that might, that I wasn't absolutely sure because I saw their test results, it doesn't hurt. I mean, it's a little prick, and you either get a heads up right away, okay, you've got HIV, or you're fine. So you want to do diagnosis, you want to get tested, and so and then you want to take the medicine that works. And that's my model for mental emotional health. And so as we look at loneliness, we want to look at the environments that are conducive to loneliness. We want to look at the kind of the cofactors. It's like when you've got 6 or 7 environments all building up, it's much worse than if you just got one. It's kind of the same with trauma. When they look at children with PTSD or the suicide rate within a country, it's not usually one thing. The Adverse Childhood Experiences test, which is a very big data-driven study that maps 10 traumas that children are often exposed to. They're, if they're lucky, they only have 1 or maybe 2. But, if they've got 5 of those 10s, their chances, their statistical probability over a sampling of 50,000, reasonably well-to-do middle-class Americans in this study with health insurance, their probability of committing suicide goes up. Their probability of lower income goes up. Their probability of being depressed goes up. Their probability of a shorter life goes up. Their probability of more hospital visits go up. And so it's important to look at all of these. So what I wanted to do is, loneliness has actually been a pretty big deal in my life. And one of the ways that I've combated it is actually by acknowledging it. Because in the same way that if AIDS or HIV is spreading through the population because the Reaganists are denying it and poking fun of it and turning it into a gay issue and all that, in that same way, if you and I are poo-pooing a chronic emotional state and saying, oh, that's for sissies, I'm not even going to look if I've got it, it's nothing, it can spread. And I'm a gardener, and if I put a rose in the shade and it wilts, I don't tell that plant to be positive. I don't say, what the fuck were you thinking? Why aren't you, I don't shout at it. I don't hit it. I don't say, I'm not going to water you until you bloom. Environment is a pretty potent thing. And if I'm an intelligent gardener, I don't just keep putting one rose after another in the shade and blaming the plant. I take the rose out of the shade, pot it in some good soil with good water, and put it in the sun. And that rose wants to grow. It wants to bloom. It wants to do its stuff. But people, because we can think, we forget that, on an evolutional level, we were plants, we became animals, and now we've added this, complex and beautiful software up here. But that doesn't mean that the rose in us is going to be predisposed to blooming and blossoming in the shade any more than those plants. And if we're smart, we don't bet against the house. The house is the environment. We don't bet against the house. We analyze the house, and the one thing that we can do that a rose can't do is we can actually pick ourselves up out of unhealthy environments. And if we've got the resources and support, we can walk into our sunlight and we can really grow. And that's what I want to be talking about right now. So with anything, 1 to 10 scale, how lonely are you? Now, the Aborigines killed off the whole person by just kind of denying the existence of the whole person. But we do something a little bit more tricky in our cultures. What we do is we deny whole segments of our psyche and inner world. We say, real men don't feel hurt in this situation, and therefore there is no hurt in this situation. Therefore, the symptoms my body's going through, the emotions I'm feeling, I'm not going to look at that. That doesn't exist. And we partition it off. We refuse to acknowledge it. Nobody else acknowledges it because it's a cultural banishment. And that part of our psyche gets the message. It is not wanted by anyone, least of all us. It is completely alone. It is completely invisible. And sometimes it curls up and dies, or curls up and starts a starvation diet and never fully dies, but is always a sick and miserable part of our psyche because we refuse to acknowledge its existence. And we do this right and left. Women aren't this way. Or the feminine, which is the receptive, spontaneous element in men and women. Feminine and men, completely different. And I won't get into that too much. But suffice it to say that there have been 10,000 cultures in human history. Every single culture has its taboos, has its denials, has its blind spots. And the parts of every one of us that were born in this kind of wholeness of the psyche that don't fit into the culture, they are partitioned off. The entire culture colludes and agrees that these will not be acknowledged, they will not be wanted, they will not be tolerated, they will be completely ignored or violently suppressed, sometimes even imprisoned. And that the self that is tolerated must participate in this alienation of self in order to be accepted in the culture. If you're a creative, dynamic person and you go to a Western school and you start moving around, stop that. That is not welcome here. Okay, that's now alone. No one wants it. No one welcomes it. No one acknowledges it. It's part of our nature. That's over there. Or we feel really beautiful and wondrous, like we start to fall in love with this wonderful tenderness for the first time. That's not welcome in high school. That is bad news. No, 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 no. You're either going to be completely bullied and humiliated, until you give that up, or you're going to do what everyone else does, and all that sensitivity, all that gentleness, all that kindness, all that innocence and wonder off into the cultural graveyard. No one's going to acknowledge. Your friends aren't, your parents aren't, your dad isn't, maybe your mom does, but that just confuses things because she draws it out again, then everyone else whacks it back and says, you're a mama's boy, or you better push your mom out with it. Now this creates a huge split between who we are and what's acceptable. And this is lonely. Because the parts of us, the parts in each one of us that are split off, have nowhere to go. Maybe they have a diary if they're lucky. If they're lucky, they have a diary. But then you got to protect that diary because it's suicide to let these taboo parts show up. So this is the situation. So this is the first cause of loneliness. And what I want to suggest is that the majority of who we are as human beings, the majority doesn't fit within almost any culture. And one of the narrowest cultures, we are brilliant within the scientific paradigm, within the technical paradigm. Brilliant. Every culture has its strength. But with that has come an incredible disdain and hostility for what doesn't fit in. I can't tell you how many scientists, and it's really bizarre. René Descartes, the founder of modern science, this just shows you kind of how schizophrenic, we can be as a culture. René Descartes, the founder of modern science, who first developed the basic paradigm of science, which was by measuring, dividing and measuring, testing, dividing and measuring, this basic protocol of science. According to him in his diary, he was visited by an angel. René Descartes was a military, was in a militia in his century, hundreds of years ago. And after a battle and in stuff like that, he had a vision of an angel coming to him who said, according to his diary, that nature and the world will be conquered by measurement, testing and measuring things. And he said, that makes sense. And he began what, hundreds of years later, is this same procedure of testing, dividing, and measuring things. But of course, the science that is born from that has split itself off from anything to where it's now suicide. Any prominent scientist who wants to, commit career suicide just has to say, I got an inspiration for this new scientific theory from an angel, laughed out of all the journals. But isn't it convenient to forget that the people doing the laughing are following the methods of one of the first scientists who got his inspiration from an angel? So we have these weird stuff around this. We're very schizophrenic. And the same is actually true with Darwin and his co-founder for the evolutionary theory. I'm forgetting his name. He was listed as the co-founder for the first several decades along with Darwin, because they came up with the theory together. But whereas Darwin did a lot of technical notes, this other scientist came to the approach through dreams and meditation and was really into spiritualism. And when that became known, he got deleted as the co-founder of that theory, because it doesn't fit the nice, clean thing that we're rational and the only stuff we believe in is our senses. So I'm just giving you a little bit of a window into this stuff. But back to loneliness. What are the conditions in which loneliness is ripe and spreads? Because that's really important. We're all vulnerable. A very interesting study over roughly 60 years with a whole region of the United States calculated that your probability of being happy or depressed was in direct proportion to your proximity with other people, thus effectively proving that emotions are viral. That not on an individual level. Like if you're a super positive person with a super great stuff going on in your life, you can get really close to a suicidal person and not be depressed. But on a statistic level, over time, the probability of you being happy, depressed, joyful, confident, self-loving, self-hating is directly proportional to these spheres of influences. And so, they've tested this hypothesis where, they'll say, okay, so who was depressed at this year? And then they'll say, okay, there's a 25% chance that the friend of that person will also be depressed. And they'll find that's the case. The 25% of the people are. And if you're right next door, there's a 50% chance that you'll be. So these are important to understand. So where does loneliness come from? It comes from other people, which means it comes when one person has loneliness that is not treated. And let's use that medical paradigm. So diagnosis, 1 to 10, how lonely are you? How much of you? So you've got a couple of different segments. So let's say your creative part that always loves to come in is always humiliated. So it's lonely like 9 out of 10. It's just not showing up. It wants to, but the degree with which it is humiliated and dismissed in your circle is such that it is, completely suppressed. And it's an important part of you. So maybe that part is, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, lonely. What about the tenderness, the part that really wants to give to others, but feels like there's not enough time? And so it's constantly subservient to this, 12-hour work ethic. It feels lonely. I wanted to give this. I saw this person. I just couldn't. I didn't have the time. I'm late on this report and stuff. There's loneliness there. There's not balance. Now the workaholic doesn't feel lonely. It's getting all the attention. It's perfectly happy. The high achiever part doesn't feel lonely. It's getting praised, da-da-da-da-da. If you're a good earner, doesn't feel lonely. So I'm, for myself, as a man growing up in the United States, I've achieved thousands of goals. I built my first house on time, on budget when I was 23. People have often considered me highly intelligent. I get compliments on my writing, my speaking, my thinking, my creativity, my entrepreneurial prowess. These parts are not lonely. They're center stage. They fit the cultural norm. These are acceptable parts. My body is not lonely in the sense of feeling, unwelcome in this culture. It's not the handsomest, not the ugliest. It's just within kind of acceptable parameters. So there are parts of me that get attention, feel great, praised, recognition, etc. But in the fullness of self, I feel lonely. There are parts of me in excruciating loneliness. And of course, these are the parts that at a very young age, I learned that I would be attacked, devalued, belittled, shamed, humiliated, bullied, betrayed, ignored, abandoned. Nobody would want to be around me when I was in that place. And these parts feel lonely. Now, some of us cut these parts off so thoroughly that we don't feel anything. Like, this is the sociopathic state of dissociation. When the trauma of the sever of the self is so deep and so strong that we completely lose consciousness of it, then the sadness and loneliness is there, but we don't understand it. It's like, wait a minute, like I had this, going on, it's like my life has never been better. And I've never been lonelier. It's like, wow, this doesn't make sense. And it's like, well, where is it coming from? You follow it back, and it's like, oh, yes. It's precisely because, the loneliness is, it's if you can imagine you're a family, and one person in the family is pretty and cool and attractive and smart and witty and all that, and so she's invited to all the parties. And we don't want those raggedy, other family members. We want nothing to do with them. And this split, to be accepted, there's such an incentive for her to pretend that those family members don't exist to her. I don't know who they are. And she moves away from them. And maybe she tells them, when I'm successful, when I've got it all handled, I'll come back for you. You're still my family. But she learns along the way that, it's suicide, social suicide, to go back and get that needy part, go back and get that unintelligent mom, go back and get that dad who's, irritates all the women and da-da-da-da-da, and makes a fool of himself and drinks too much, or this, or is too, naive and makes me look like a fool, or doesn't make enough money. So they get pushed aside. And she's off and she's there. And then she arrives and she's like, I've made it. And those relatives are saying, don't we ever belong? Don't we matter? So maybe she feels it, maybe she doesn't, but it has impact. Just because you've dissociated, just because you're not aware, those parts of ourselves that we separated from at birth want to come back. And I think the sadness and the pain and the loneliness hit me when I had lots of time on my hands, lots of money, lots of freedom, and thought I'd achieved it all. It's like, I'm here. But then there's this echo. It's like, this isn't arrival. The parts that this culture has allowed and sanctioned have gone about as far as they can go and are perfectly happy. But what about that tenderness? What about that generosity? What about that kind curiosity? What about that naive, innocent part? What about that playful little boy? What about this? What about that has all the life? Those parts are as unwelcome as they ever were in this reality. And I'm realizing that if I don't go back for them, if I don't try and reconnect with some of those parts of myself, I'm going to die, having lived a third of a life, where 2/3 of me was a lie. And the lie was those parts don't exist. And those parts have been shamed, abandoned, betrayed by so many people, including me, including me. Because to get ahead in this world, we have to cut off those parts. We have to act as if they don't exist, because they're not welcome at the party. So I've been in this tension, having a lot more freedom than most over the last 10 years, and I've been playing around with it. I'm a contractor, and for example, I make a lot of money if I play my little contractor hat, which is show up on time, talk about numbers, talk about results, use quantitative analysis, show how each of my ideas is the best response to that particular technical and taste situation and within the budget, and get the jobs done. No problem there. But if the reality for me is I care more about my clients' marriages than I do about the contracting work I do. And so if I see, a wife shaming her husband, or if I see a man bullying his wife, if I see contention around the project, the truth of me is that I think, you fools, you think it's about having this cool contract transformation. You think it's about ending up in the magazine, but look at your marriage. I don't think you should do this project if it's going to strain that. That's what's important to me, relationship. But I've learned the hard way. It's like I think, oh, that's really sane. But if I say, that doesn't seem very kind to say that to your wife. I think learning to talk together like this in a healthier way is more important than this project. The response is my value just plummets in this culture. This is a perfectly sane, healthy part of me that is smart enough to know that our human relationships will affect our well-being more than the curb appeal of a contract project. And data bears that up. It's scientific. But it's not the role. And so basically on a $100,000 project, if I play the full me, my playfulness, my full creativity, the focus on the feelings, the focus on the relationship, very often the client balks at paying even 70% of my normal fees. But if I play the typical sociopathic role of I'm just here, ma'am, and I'm here, sir, to help you get the job done, and that's what I do, and I'm a great contractor, and I'm on time and on budget and all that, they just pour the money at me. And I don't like it. I don't like it at all. I have fired some customers because I said I don't need the money, and I'm not willing to be paid top dollar to put up with your abusive tactics in your marriage. And of course, this is completely unprofessional, and that's painful to me. It's painful to me that sticking up for someone's heart is considered taboo within any role within this culture, but it is. And I'm giving you a little bit of a sense of where the pain and where the loneliness might lie. Because we've been so trained and ingrained into the culture that 90% of the contractors and people advising me in the country would say, Dane, you fool, shut up about that. That's not your job. Just take the money. The same thing with the Germans and Hitler. You fool, do what you're told. That's not your job. Just follow the cultural order. And I'm not saying that within that context politeness isn't appreciated, or the little warm joke that distracts from the cutting remark so-and-so just made with his partner, that glosses over that isn't appreciated. I'm just saying that in America, my experience is that people want to pay me at least 30% less if I live and identify that the emotions of the people involved are as important to me as getting stuff done. And that's painful. So I make, so I play with that, I fiddle with it, but I'm just giving you a sense of one area. So the environment in which loneliness spreads rather than heals in this kind of situation is, first of all, an environment in which it is denied. So let's look at how that particular thing gets denied in my life. I talk about this, and a lot of the time someone will say, why do you care? They're just, you don't know these people. You're not their friend. They're just people. Why do you care? In other words, what's wrong with you for caring? There's no problem here at all. You can effectively make money, which we all know is the only relevant thing here. In fact, you should be proud of yourself. You can make a lot of money, and I do. You can make a lot of money. There's no problem here at all. You just don't get it. You shouldn't be caring about people. You shouldn't be caring about their feelings. Didn't anyone teach you that? This is not professional. And so in other words, they're like, Dan, you're really smart. You've just made this dumb mistake. You've brought one of these taboo parts into one of these taboo areas of this culture. And isn't it wonderful? You can just get rid of that part and play the role that you're asked to play, and everyone will be happy. No one will be mad at you. No one will think you're an idiot. And, you're a smart dude. I'm sure you'll figure this out. In other words, I'm sure you'll don't do that. But what if you don't want to? What if the rules are so onerous that sometimes it's worth making 30% less money consciously? And, and I've actually had arguments. I play around with it in a lot of different ways. One of the things that I do is right now I take every other month off to go to Thailand, which is a culture in which emotions rule. Nobody cares what I think in Thailand. Nobody cares how articulate I am. Nobody says, oh, you're so smart and all that. They only focus on my feelings, and they respond to my kindness. And so this is actually a way of healing part of that loneliness. It's changing the environment. It's getting out of that shady soil in that area of my psyche in the United States and going into sunny soil. Italy and Thailand are both, and for that matter, all of Europe, are dramatically more predisposed to emotion. Not all of it, England and stuff, and so so I move myself into better soil, basically, and then I grow easily, of course. Those parts love to come out. And so, so what's the environment? What's the pain level? Who's feeling the pain? And then this can naturally lead to other co-infections. In other words, loneliness that can't be healed, parts of ourselves that are important but that have no space in the culture. No space in the culture. Another one is spontaneity. Getting up in the morning and what's the most exciting thing I could do today? Oh, and I'd like to play with this person and hang out with this person. It's like, well, let's call this person. Don't answer the phone. Let's call this. Could you text me? I'm busy right now. Let's call this person. No. What are you talking about? You can schedule something, how about 30 minutes in 2 weeks? It's like, no, let's do something right now. It's like, yeah, that's not how my life works. And when the taboo is very strong and deeply ingrained, every single person sets up their lives and routines to avoid the taboo. In this case, the taboo of spontaneous play. But that's one of the richest parts of me, when I can create those moments. And again, I'm in Thailand right now for 2 months. I will experience more spontaneous play and childlike innocence in Thailand in a month than I know how to create with all my smarts in a year in the United States. Because of that, I'm willing to pay $30,000 a month in time off work and stuff to be here. But not everyone can do that. But we still deserve empathy and awareness that there's not something wrong with us. There is often something wrong with the environment. And if you're around 100 people with flu, and you're one of 2% who doesn't have it, it's just a matter of time before you go through a stressful period or something, whatever, and lo and behold, you catch the flu. But if you are around completely healthy people, and you go through that same stressful time, it just passes in a few days, you don't get sick at all, and you get brought back up into good health. And this is actually one of the things that I'm inferring in this, is we need to do this together. We in America, we think this is part of that taboo. We think it's all about the individual. It's not. The probability field is created by the group, the country, the culture. And the probability field is like the current of the river. So some cultures have, or a headwind, that's kind of another way of putting it. So some cultures have a 200 mile per hour headwind. If you want the plane to actually fly and actually make progress, it has to fly at least 201 miles an hour, or it's actually flying backwards. It can be airborne and run for 24 hours a day and actually be flying backwards if it's a plane with a 150 mile an hour engine against a 200 mile an hour headwind. And so you need to know what you're dealing with. And the headwind is the percentage of the population who will punish you for going into a certain area of one's psyche and expressing it, rather than honor that and welcome it, one. And it is the degree and severity and longevity of the punishment. So, for example, in the United States at the present time, we are very anti-consciousness exploration with psychedelics and all that. The mainstream, control freaks within the culture, when they saw what was happening in the 60s, they took like LSD, which has lower side effects and a higher, you can take 200 times the recommended dose of LSD without signs of toxicity. You take Prozac, more than 10 or 20 times higher than the recommended dose, you can end up dead. It's so we've singled out consciousness transcendent experiences and just said they are not welcome. They scare the control structure here. They're not welcome. They're not welcome to be explored scientifically. Screw science in this area. We're just going to block it off. It's like science forgetting that Descartes got his thing in an angel vision. And just to be clear, Descartes was a Christian, and so an energetic experience is going to come to him through his mythology. The clear thing is not an angel of this or that or the other. It's the awareness that in our human history, a surprising number of breakthroughs in this and that and the other have come, whether it's Einstein or Descartes or the colleague, talking about the evolution of species. A surprising number of that is coming not through the linear rational brain that we're all elevating to the most wonderful thing. And it's the same in investing. I mean, Warren Buffett is probably the best, really go by the books, and that really does work when you got a good method. But George Soros, another billionaire, makes a lot of his decisions, according to close colleagues, by a pain in his back that alerts him that there's a pattern in play that some part of him knows from all of his years in the market and all that, but his conscious mind didn't see. So when he gets that pain in the back, he redoubles and stuff, and he often reverses choice. And so it's not this mental analysis. It's like, oh my God, when I ignore that pain in my back and the market is going like this and I don't get out of it, I lose billions. So I don't do it. And so this is, this. I'm just kind of educating us in this terrain of taboo. So let's zero in specifically then on these areas of loneliness. So one condition of loneliness is when loneliness itself is not acknowledged, and it kind of becomes a vicious circle. So the culture says, like I've been told my whole life, you're a guy, you're not sensitive, you're interested in sex, you want this, get it together and do that. And if I do, there's smiles, and of course, and it doesn't even matter if that's sane. I mean, like, I've never cheated on a woman in my entire life. But I've gotten the message that that's okay, because that's what guys do. Just don't do it in front of me, just, of course I expect you to cheat on me, but for goodness sake, lie about it. Well, that's a real big affront to one of my core values of transparency and really being able to trust someone. So I have no trouble with being in an open relationship, but don't ask me to lie about it. If you're fine with that and you're too busy to engage fully, then let's just have a very clear agreement that when I'm not with you and you're choosing to put other things more important, I may be in other relationships, including sex. And if that's not okay with you, let's have that be clear right now and either show up for one another so that I'm not at loose ends when I'd really like to be spending time with someone special. Or let's separate and you can find someone else who is one of those workaholic men that is fit into the program and doesn't have any more time than you and want to show up, or that you have more time than him, and so that's fine. But don't ask me to lie about it. This isn't actually an area of loneliness for me. So to be told men lie about sex, men lie about sex, men lie about sex, give me a break, don't pretend you're all whatever. And I'm like, I'm not pretending. I don't lie about sex. I don't lie about anything to a friend or lover, period. And I don't want you to do that to me. Well, you think you're better than us? You're da-da-da-da-da? No. I want solid, trustworthy relationships. And so, yes, I understand the short-term payoff, but it doesn't feel like that to me. I feel lonely when I'm lying or feel like I'm being lied to. I feel lonely. And I've got enough of that already. No attraction to increase that just for a little thrill. I feel lonely. But I also feel lonely that you don't get it. That our values are so far apart. You don't get that. You don't understand it's not a sacrifice. The real sacrifice would be to take a short-term sex for me and not feel that I'm a trustworthy person and that I'm contributing to someone else's loneliness by lying to you. That would be a real hard thing for me to live with. But it is a hard thing for me to live with, that despite that fact, I am viewed as someone else, someone projected on me. I'm told over and over and over again that you're not interested in my feelings. I'm like, that's the only thing I'm really interested in is your feelings. Nah, guys aren't interested in your feelings. It's like, so I'm kind of illustrating the overlay. And one of the things that may be happening, and you can check this out for yourself, is that if you've heard who you are and you feel lonely, if you've heard who you are, you're a woman, you're like this, you're a guy, you're like this, you're not actually like that. You know deep inside that's not who you are. But you hear that that is who you are, and you get that whether you are that way or not, you will be treated that way. It hurts because you realize the reality is this person doesn't see me, they don't want to see me, they're not willing to see me, they don't have the imagination to see me, so I do not exist. A guy who doesn't lie and doesn't cheat does not exist as a possibility in this woman's mind. And I care about this woman. So if I want to exist for her, if I want to be real, I've actually got to go cheat, because then she'll understand me and actually feel closer to me, because then I fit her cultural norm. Fine, I thought for a moment, I'm going crazy and whatever, but of course guys cheat, don't worry about it. So there's this incentive that if the spotlight is shining over here and you're not in it, and they're seeing here, but it doesn't include you, the incentive is to say, okay, I'll get my head over into it. Now do you see me? Oh, there you are. But they're not seeing you any more than they did before. They're still seeing their projection. You've just moved yourself into calibration with their projection, because they wouldn't move their projection over and actually see you. This is a source of loneliness. It's a source of loneliness that you'll only discover if and when you have the impulse, and motivation and courage, because it does take courage to step outside of the cultural norms, to not be normal when that involves honoring yourself. And in that situation, what you'll realize is that people who've said they know you and they get you and they care about you and they see you your whole life, when you move out of the terrain in which they project, feel comfortable and imagine, they will not let go of their projection. And if you force them, if you really say, hey, I'm here, and they can't get it, they'll disconnect. Or you'll be so fed up that they're not relating to you at all. They're relating to this little box that they've got inside their mind that is more efficient. See, projections are very efficient. They're generalities, stereotypes, projections. They're very efficient. Because if you can just say all men are, all women are, all Americans are, blah, 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 you don't have to see. You save a lot of energy, and you can just act as if and focus on your work and the stuff the culture says is more important. But for someone that steps outside of that box, there is loneliness, first of all, that you're not seen. The second level of loneliness is that when someone or a group or a country refuses to see that they don't see, then there's a new level of loneliness, because now you're lonely that someone doesn't see your loneliness. And then you may have anger about that. Like, I feel frustrated, at times. It's like, yet another person not seeing this, not valuing what they don't see, sure that they do see, and completely oblivious to the loneliness that I feel about not being seen. Number one, and then not being seen that I'm not being seen. And then number three, because when you start with a faulty equation, it's like a scientific thing. It's like, let's say you're dealing with a test tube, and the scientist has had their eyes calibrated that blue and red stuff doesn't show up in their eyes. And humans are actually calibrated that densely. The stories of the first ships coming to the Americas document that the natives couldn't see they couldn't see the ship. They could only see the little boat because that was within their frame of reference. So they didn't have the eyes to recognize a pattern that big and in that shape. So they couldn't see, but these little boats would seem to come out of nowhere. There's other documents that show that at first the color blue was kind of a new concept for some tribes and humans. They would talk about the Red Sea or this, and it's like, it's beautifully blue, but they didn't at that time have the calibration to imagine it, which should be a bit of a clue that our consciousness can only see what it's calibrated to see, even with our eyes. In fact, brain scientists show that only 50% of what our eye is taking in, this brain is registering as reality. At any given moment, the brain is only processing 50% of the data coming in. Now, it's all true. Like my brain may be noticing the beam back there, whereas your brain is noticing the hue of the curtain, and another person's brain is noticing that little light over there, and another's noticing this, and another person isn't noticing that. They're paying attention to the glint here. But every brain is missing 50% of what's going on at one stage or another. And they show that beautifully in that gorilla test thing where they say, count the number of bounces in this basketball, and you're busy, this, that, and the other. And a gorilla walks right through the basketball court in center stage, and most people were so busy counting they didn't see the gorilla. And you say, how many was there? And they're like, other than, did you see anything strange? No. No. And then you watch and it's on film, and you watch it again. It's like, how could that happen? The way it can happen is that because the brain can only process 50% of the sensory data in a given moment, it's based on your intention and interest that determines which bit ends up in that 50%. This is another avenue of possible loneliness, because you go to a political rally and you hear this and this and this, and your partner with a different perspective hears the exact opposite. And it's like, how did you hear that in that speech? I heard this. Well, I heard this. So there's loneliness. It's like, my reality doesn't exist. And to some degree, it doesn't. Because if it was a true 50-50 split, when you have these strong divides within group, if it's a true 50-50 split, where you're measuring everything to the right of this line and they're measuring everything to the left of that line, they don't seem to add up at all. I mean, you can agree on maybe what they were wearing or whatever, but the meaning of what they said and all that is completely different. So this is a source of loneliness. Am I going crazy? Is my partner out to get me? Don't they get it? That can be going on right in this conversation. I'm talking about this, and I'm remembering, the client that fired me for giving her an appreciation. I'm remembering, and she said, you're perfectly qualified for this and that and the other. I just don't like to have emotions with my contractor. Or the person that, approving all the change orders, this and that, right and left, with smiles, and then as soon as you talk to them about, the way their child seems to be depressed and could anything help, and have they read this book, then suddenly they're angry and everything's late and da-da-da-da-da, despite the fact of being early. They're inventing stuff as the basis of their anger. Or the fact, that, I'm thinking of these details, and then you're thinking of, no, when I smile at my clients, they like it. Or you're thinking of other facts. And this can create an experience of loneliness. Or even someone talking about loneliness has the basis of their feeling of loneliness questioned. Like, no, that's all wrong. Well, then you feel lonely because you still feel the loneliness and you still see your reality, but according to the person you're sharing your feeling to, that reality doesn't exist because they think their reality is more important than your reality. Even if they acknowledge, okay, maybe that had happened, but that doesn't matter. That's your reality. My reality matters. That's loneliness. You don't matter. You're not seen. You're not understood. So this is an environment. And in cultures which the American culture epitomized, in which we're valued for talking, we're valued for leading, we're valued for articulating, and we're valued for our smarts. Nobody wants to listen, to feel, to be emotional, to be empathic, to be the student. So there's talkers and no listeners. But this is a cultural thing that creates loneliness. It's a chauvinism is what it is, because if you look at it technically, does a teacher have any value at all if there is not a single student able or willing to learn from them, or even existing? The teacher's value plummets. If the teacher has 1 million people able and willing to learn something valuable for them, the teacher's value goes up 1,000,000-fold because of the student, meaning the teacher's value is predicated on the student. The student's value is predicated on the teacher. If you have 1,000,000 students all waiting to learn with bated breath, all with their pencil sharpened, all ready to take that teaching out in the world and change the world, and there is no teacher, the student has no value within that paradigm. Just to kind of follow on, they have no value. Because an eager, exceptional student ready to go and act on it gets all of their value from an excellent teacher that teaches them something worth acting on. And a teacher gets all of their value from students who respect and care and show up and learn and do it. In other words, neither is more important than the other. It's just yin and yang, electrical flow. You can't say the white pole is more valuable than the black pole. Without them, you don't get electricity. With an outlet, you can't say the plug is really cool and valuable and we all want to be plugs. So there's no outlets to plug them into, and so no electrical current, and there's no light, and there's no engine or anything. You've got to have polarity. But in our culture, speakers are cool, teachers are cool. Students, learners, listeners, they're not quite ready to step into the real leadership role that has the value, the alpha role. And so nobody wants to do it. And so a lot of us feel lonely just from that. We want to talk, they want to talk. We feel weak if we listen and we do all the talking. We feel small and humiliated because we're told that listening, caring, and empathizing and being of service is less than, means we're not important. So we don't want to feel unimportant. So we compete to talk. Well, this creates two lonely people. This is a dynamic. Chauvinism, which is not just about men and women. It's about valuing speakers more than listeners. It's about valuing assertiveness more than receptivity. And yet, if you try and dance and someone leads and no one follows, there's no dance, there's violence. There's no value in assertiveness without responsiveness and receptivity. There's no value in the masculine without the feminine. And this is not gender, so you can have masculine, feminine polarity in all transgender, all sexual thing. But if someone says, hey, let's go out and do this now, and the answer from every single person around them is no, the invitation has no value. It doesn't go anywhere. But if someone says, hey, let's go do this, and 3 people say, yeah, I want to do it, and the person says, well, I can only do it with one, who wants it the most? it has extraordinary value. So let's go do it. And stuff happens. Flow is a response to this duality being respected. Flow is a response to that. It has enormous value. So back to loneliness. When, so for example, as a guy dating and wanting to invite potent invitations, like let's do something really amazing. And in America, 60% ignoring. Just, I'm busy. I'm busy with stuff. I'm not available that day anyway, so I'm just going to be silent. So there's all this creativity and invitation, and then it's not honored. It's silent. And then someone else says, I don't like to do that. I just like to, have a 20-minute coffee break and then maybe something later and this and that and the other. And it's like, oh gosh, another coffee break. Why not do something exciting? So there's loneliness. There's loneliness. When the statistics reach a certain point, more than 1 to 10, where I have to do more than 10 invitations for every yes or every invitation that I receive from a partner that I'm interested in. There's loneliness. One of the conditions of loneliness is when you give more than you receive. And you can probably notice that if you've ever been in love with someone who found you annoying, but you really saw their beauty and so you hung on to that a little bit, there's loneliness because they mean everything to you in their beauty and their grace, but you mean nothing to them. This kind of loneliness in the kind of unrequited love is one of the conditions that can lead to suicide from loneliness. It's the disparity of giving honor and respect that is not reciprocated. It's the heartbreak that a woman feels when it's like, you mean everything to me. I just want to be with you. And it's like, get off of me with that needy crap. I hate it. Get away from me. The disparity of vulnerable honoring a need and disdainful disgust and disrespectful dismissal and rejection is a source of profound pain and loneliness. And then, when that's added to by the judgment, the cultural judgment that not only do I not balance or respect your vulnerability in any way, I'm going to judge you because you're one of those needy people. And in this culture, neediness is not welcome. Independence, autonomy, smarts, wit. If you're one of those people that really got how interesting it was to be sadistic or this or that interesting experiment, you'd be cool. But you're needy, you're nothing. This is part of the thing. Need is banished. Need, emotional need, is absolutely taboo within the mainstream American culture. And since every single person has emotional need in some part of their psyche, not the conscious part in many cases, and particularly for men, it's hidden. But it's there. But it is there in a state of being absolutely certain that if it shows its head, it will be crucified, humiliated, abandoned, and betrayed instead of honored, welcome, and treated kindly. And that is a state of loneliness. To know that some of the most vulnerable parts of who we are as human beings will be slaughtered simply for coming to the table. The uninvited guest in that Rumi poem, it's miserable. And what happens again in these vicious circles? So what's actually very interesting is that usually the people that have the strongest need in an adult form had need attacked, betrayed, dismissed, and humiliated the most intensely in the state in which we all were completely needy. I mean, let's get real here. When you are 4 pounds and will not survive without a hospital, without milk, without money, without heat, without scientific equipment, and in which any adult in that thing could just whack you with a hand and you'd be dead and have complete lack of ability to defend yourself. No capacity to defend yourself, no capacity to live, no capacity to do anything you need for several years. That is an emotional state that is part of our psyche that every human being has gone to, and it's that same schism you see, like when science just conveniently forgets all of the transcendent states that many of the most brilliant scientists thrive on, whether it's Edison's dream. Like Edison had a completely soundproof room specifically built so that right after his nap, when he had gestalts of awareness, he could write down the solving of his problems. But now you have Jack Welch, the typical alpha male. He doesn't take naps. He's a power. He doesn't, none of that bullshit. He's running $1 billion company. But it is founded on Edison going against the grain and saying, I am not going to have my creativity trampled by the ignorance of this education system. I know that my genius comes from dreams. So I am going to take a nap. I'm going to spend tens of thousands of dollars building a soundproof room, and every day I'm going to put a notebook there, and I'm going to create 10,000 inventions and create the greatness of this independent company, which is independent, which is dependent on the altered states of geniuses who are usually the most open to admitting that it's not really how smart they are, it's how open they are to these other parts of the mind that are taboo, where they cart you off into an insane asylum if you try and start to do that. Taboo within many families, taboo within many cultures. So this is the loneliness. So I wrote a couple of sentences, and I want to talk just a little bit about them, just because mostly I'm here in Thailand. I've got 2 months, but the typical viewer is way outside their little box, allowed for new information. This is supposed to be a 5-minute soundbite. So the part of me that needs and loves to explore the interconnected galaxies for hours and hours is, of course, not welcome, feels lonely in a culture that demands that everything better be simple, clear, to the point, less than 5 minutes, got it, no feelings, move on, done. Check it off, check it off, check it off, check it off. It's all that matters. It's all that matters. It's a repeat. It's a robot. It's not fully human. But it is the dictum within the media, etc., etc. So anyway, I'm going to read a little bit of that here, and we'll just see, because this, back to that meta conversation, I decided I didn't really want to write a whole book about loneliness. But I did want to give it a thorough honoring since the idea came up today, and then focus on other things. So loneliness is waking up and not knowing how to get home. It may be, I don't know where home is, or it may be there is a feeling and there is a part of me and I know who that part is, but there's just no context in this world for me to be that me with grace. And here's a little bit what I mean by that. Take a harpist. And then the magic that is possible in a still, attention-wrapped place. When the moment comes, when the cost of building and sustaining the real estate relative to turning it into a stock market or something, other, and the amount the population will pay for a ticket to sit for 2 hours and listen to harping, the harpist has no place within the culture and dies. They have to give up harping and come up with something, working for Google to get more clicks or whatever it said. This is the connection. And for me personally, diving deeply, giving and being of service on a spontaneous level and being seen in the joy and innocence of wanting to do that is one of the closest parts that I can tell of who I am. And I have yet, in 42 years, to find a single place where I can do that gracefully and spontaneously and let it have its magical effect, as opposed to, get out of my way, I'm trying to pass you in the car, do this, do that. You're not supposed to see that. Do I know you? Why? This isn't your business. So we have all these rules that block this part. It's none of your business. Guys don't have feelings. You shouldn't care. I'm busy. I'm busy anyway. I don't like people looking at me too closely. So these are all fence posts and grids. And this part of me can't get through very often. It's on the other side of the grid. It's beautiful. I love it. I know it to be a part of me. And I know it's not welcome. And it's that feeling of, there's this feeling, and I want to share it. And I don't know how to get there. Number 2, loneliness is being told by a channeled entity that they love me and are my friend, but won't talk with me without money and a scheduled appointment, and they won't let me talk. They do all the monologuing. When for me, a friend is a back and forth. It's a dialogue. And you don't pay a friend to be your friend. I had this experience with the channel Lazarus. On the one hand, there's all this word, we love you, we're your friend, we're not a teacher, we're not a guru, but then you don't even get to listen to us for less than $29.95 for a tape package. We don't want to hear what you have to say. We don't want to hear how it's working. We don't talk about our experience. You can't talk. And it's like, well, that doesn't feel like a friend to me. The energy's great, the information's interesting and all that, but it doesn't feel like a friend to me. Well, that doesn't matter because we're not going to listen. But we do love you, we are your friend. This, I think, speaks to that situation when, people say, oh, of course I love you, this and that and the other, but do you love me enough to learn what love looks like to me and what feels good to me? Or do you love yourself enough to say, this is what works for me, and I'm going to do it, whether you like it or not, and because I don't want to call that bullying or rough riding over you, I'm just going to call it love. I love you, and get out of my way, and we're going to do it this way or that way, or that'll be trouble. It's an area of possible loneliness in a relationship when one person is dominating but calling it friendship and love. Loneliness is being born to 2 emotionally unavailable parents and needing to lie about the pain that we feel because they're not strong and able to hear about their impact. In other words, when you have two unavailable children for parents, able to function in the world, but emotionally, 2 to 6 years old, a lot of the time in their reaction and their tit for tat and their competitiveness and jealousy and this and that and the other, not the guiding, protective, emotional, strong, able to hear your feelings, so afraid of your feelings they need to manipulate. No, you don't feel that. No, 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 no. Don't do that. Don't do that. You're scaring me with your emotions. Could you just lie? Because we can't deal with it. There's loneliness. About being alone. About not being able to connect deeply. And then on top of that, rather than feeling how painful that is, how separate, how disappointing that is, how confusing and scary that is, we're going to add the third wave of loneliness, which is we need you to lie to everyone else and us so that we, the parents, can feel safe. Because we're not strong enough to deal with your truth. We don't want to. We don't care enough about you to tolerate and make space to understand why you feel what you feel around us. And this talks about the thing again, in any relationship where you have feelings and someone is more committed to talking you out of those feelings than they are to understanding, validating, and listening. The first loneliness is the wave of feelings. You're doing all the talking. When you said that, you really hurt me. You made me look small in front of these groups. You told that very private thing that I told you not to tell in front of people. I learned something that I'm listening to you talk to them, and I learned something about you that you didn't think was important to share to me, and I'm your wife, I'm your husband. So this is all the first loneliness. I don't feel important at all in your life. I don't even know why we're married. I feel alone. I feel unimportant. I feel used for your entertainment value. I feel expedient. Wave number one. Wave number two is I absolutely know you do not want to hear my feelings. Two, when I tell you anyway, that hurts, by the way. Knowing that the other person doesn't want to hear, it hurts. It's a betrayal. It's lonely. They'd rather have you pretend to be feeling this than acknowledge what you actually feel. And finally, when you say it anyway, with that sinking feeling that they don't want to hear it, and they read the paper and ignore it and pretend you have said nothing, or what was that? I'm busy with this. Can that wait? Whatever, and interrupting really vulnerable stuff. In part of a pattern of always being busy. It's not like, oh, this is really important. I'm busy with this. Let me come back to this in an hour. That's respectful. But I'm busy. I'm still busy. Could we talk about something else? You're still And then after they've delayed you 3 or 4 times for a week, then they flip it again, like they've delayed you for a week, not honored it at all, and then they flip it again and say, you're still dealing with that thing? You've brought it up 5 times already. Yeah, I brought it up 5 times. You've rejected, diminished, interrupted, and blamed me every single time I've interrupted. You've never made an alternative available. And so where I would have liked it not to have happened in the first place, I would like my feelings to be listened to when I brought it up. I've had to bring up sensitive, painful things that are obvious to any empathic human being 5 times, and now that's loneliness. Loneliness is desperately needing someone. So it goes back to that thing, I talked about, we've all gone through that phase of being needy. But when you were slammed, when you were traumatized, when you were abused, when you had cigarette butts stuck in your feet, when you have been betrayed, first by the parents, but I don't know if you've noticed this around abused children, particularly in the West, but it's worldwide. People often know on the peripheral of their awareness that children are being abused. And then they have a choice. The teacher, the other parent, the friend, the stranger watching it has a choice. Do they risk the rage and retaliation of the parent who will defend their right to abuse and hurt their child in order to protect the child? Or do they sacrifice the child and their well-being, as the parent is doing, for the expediency of processing difficult emotions? In other words, a child brings up a really overwhelming feeling that the adult doesn't know how to deal with. So the adult tells the child to be quiet. If the child can't because they're busy feeling something, maybe the parent hits them or threatens them or bribes them. If they still bring up, maybe there's violence, or maybe there's retaliation later, or abandonment, or I'm going to leave you, or whatever. I mean, my mother used to kind of say things like, I'm leaving the house and I'm never coming back. And we were out in a completely isolated place. When you're 5-year-old, you don't know. And so you learn, I've got to stop. I've got to stop doing these things. I've got to stop feeling these things. What do I do with these parts of me that are not safe and welcome here? Where do I put them? How do I hide them? I don't know. Because when they're so threatening to regressed parents or other adults or the culture at large, they can't even acknowledge that they're there long enough to coach you on how to hide them. You've got to figure that out for yourself. They need you to pretend they're not there, but since they are there, they can't say, well, could you just write them in your journal because I can't deal with them? Well, that would place the insanity on them, and they can't deal with it. So they've got to, in some way, shove you into not dealing with it and then get you to lie that they were never there in the first place, because that's the only time they can relax and feel safe that their own repressed, lonely, separate wounds and unresolved issues won't flood back into their consciousness and get them shamed out of the same box in the culture that they're putting you in. This is why wounds go forward, or they get healed and they get addressed. And that's loneliness. Knowing for sure that if you talk about this stuff, your own parents and every adult around you will sell you out and shame you in whatever way is necessary to shut you up, because they're not comfortable with the truth. That's a betrayal. That's a disappointment. It's a deep pain, and it's lonely. And then when you can't talk about the loneliness and how much it hurts, it's one step further. And that's the core through all of this. So loneliness happens in a whole variety of ways. But when you can't talk about the loneliness, when you can't acknowledge the loneliness, it gets worse rather than better. Because you become lonely, that you were lonely, that nobody saw that you were lonely, that it's taboo to have any emotions about being lonely, that you are lonely, and that no one is willing to see that you're lonely. That the fear of being punished for bringing this stuff up cannot be talked about either. That's another secret. So there's the loneliness now so now there's fear that can't be talked about for bringing up that it's lonely, Now there's loneliness that it's lonely that can't be brought up. And there's loneliness that can't be brought up. And there's the original pain and betrayal that cannot be talked about in this little sphere of social acceptability. And all of that gets carted off with great energy and grief and trauma and pushed off on the side. And if you can't cope, if you, the vulnerable child and individual, can't cope with this huge bag of shoved off lies that have been demanded of you to be liked and accepted and all that, because the payoff is there. If you can shut all that off and pretend it doesn't exist and project it onto other people and join in the shaming of that minority that just can't keep up the lie, that's killing themselves, that's depressed, that's breaking down in tears, and if you will pretend that they're weird and have nothing to do with this family and nothing to do with this country, they're weirdos, they're losers, and we hate them and make fun of them, then there are high rewards. You can get invited to witty parties, you can make big deals, you can have a great time, you can enjoy yourself completely oblivious that that's you, that those people carted off to prison, that those raving lunatics along the street are us. Those are the carted off, lied about, denied parts that have to show up somewhere, because they don't just vanish, they just vanish from view. And that's one of our deepest seated fears, that somehow the roles will be replaced and the stepsister, the taboo self, will somehow find its way into our reality, and we'll somehow find our way into that taboo place, and we'll be the person on the street. We'll be the person wandering around muttering and not being able to get over that gripe of the last betrayal. We'll be the people stark raving mad. And that terror does not lead this culture or most people to start developing dialogue and saying nobody should end up that way. We need to find out what's going on here. We need to find out what is happening for these individuals, learn their story, and give them honor in some way within the culture, not partitioned. So what tends to happen more is kind of the old congressman with the gays phenomena, where, you know, the congressman who meets men in the gay bathhouse turns around and is the most virulently, violently anti-homosexual on the Congress floor. That's a metaphor for what we do when we're threatened by those taboo parts of ourselves coming back. It's you know, in the Harry Potter story, it's Voldemort, an abandoned, shamed orphan, ashamed of his mother and his father, a half-blood, a minority, someone devalued, who not only becomes sociopathic with all that shame and trauma, that's what every human being does. The reptilian brain is non-empathic, it's sociopathic. So when you experience enough abuse and trauma, you realize the world is not safe and you need strategy and cold logic to manipulate just to be safe. That's what a sociopath is. It's a human being who has experienced enough abuse and scary situations for their systems in the way they saw it, that their brain has told them, you are not safe to be a human being here. You must be a calculating animal. And you can use all the intelligence, and often sociopaths are incredibly brilliant, but there's no feeling. Warren Buffett is incredibly intelligent, but the story that is told favorably about his rigor in investing, he has his routine, and on his way home, he stepped right over his son, splayed out on the floor, crying and in pain. Just stepped on right up the steps, doing his exact normal routine, went in, read his stock reports. And so the brilliance of the sociopath is their power to see patterns like no one else can in order to help them survive. The wound is that what took them into that? Buffett had an incredibly abusive childhood. And some part of him, obviously, as long as that kind of behavior is happening, hasn't got that he's now in a safer world. So he's stuck there. That's what happens with PTSD, complex PTSD. That's lonely. And when you know you're different and you're stuck in a sociopathic world and everyone's blaming sociopaths, sociopaths are human beings like you and me who have received enough shock in certain vulnerable areas in some way that is completely lied about and denied within the culture, that reduces them into their reptilian brain, where they look out their eyes one day and all they can see is how to manipulate, how to get what they want, how to achieve certain goals, and other people's feelings don't have the same meaning to them, just like their own feelings are completely walled off. See, our feelings are the doorway into other people's feelings. As soon as you enter the reptilian brain, you lose contact with a lot of those inner feelings, which means you no longer have a basis upon which to empathize, which is the sociopathic state. There are no sociopaths. There are human beings shocked into a sociopathic state, and often in a sociopathic culture, a culture that does not kindly, compassionately pursue an interest in what helps an individual in that culture feel safe and good, but pursues its own dogmas and agendas. In a sociopathic culture, many people who enter that sociopathic state stay there for hours, days, decades, because the culture that knocked them into that doesn't help them out of that. It's a blind spot. But they're in there and they know they're different, and they feel ashamed on some level, like something's wrong with me. The thought is there. And that in itself adds to the pain that greets them as soon as they lift up into this more human part of the brain and feel it's just too painful. People need help to go through trauma and go through shame. It's an area of loneliness. Loneliness is desperately needing someone when everyone rejects you on the basis that you are too needy. I have dealt with this as a man because there's a certain stage in a relationship where the relationship brings up a reliving of those terrified moments in childhood when I desperately did need my parents to survive. And rather than being there for me, they took advantage of that vulnerability to hurt me intentionally. And that's absolutely terrifying. And I don't know how to not go through that phase if I want to stay human and really feel all my feelings. But I'm in a culture where that is unsexy, uncool, blah-da-da-da-da. And I'm not willing to lie. I'm not willing to pretend that I'm not going through that. So I've worked with that in a variety of ways, often with connecting with very sensitive, empathic women over 50 years old who are not afraid and who have moved through the immaturity of the culture of denying emotion and actually really care. But there is a sociopathic element where many Americans are in so much threat and need within their own self that the idea of being around someone that goes through a needy phase, they're just completely hostile. They have no interest in understanding it. They have no interest in understanding how barbaric it is to reject that. Because it's, you're going through that infantile feeling again. And if you don't understand how evil it is for a parent to exploit that vulnerability, this is the cause of at least 40% of the suffering in American culture, and at least 40% of the retardation of the possible innovation and economy is the barbaric, ignoring, betraying, lack of attuning, lack of education, lack of skill, fear, the whole way that children get abandoned in those states. and the refusal to remember what it's like to be a child, where a parent is literally like a 4-ton, proportional to your weight now as an adult. A parent is a 4-ton, 30-foot tall giant who booms and shouts and throws things. And if you today were met by a 4-ton, 30-foot giant who was unpredictable and had no interest in protecting you, and if you got in their way, you were just swiped aside, you would be in trauma like that, and everyone would get it. Everyone would get it. Wow, I mean, this is terrifying. Get out. The area would be evacuated. One 30-foot giant like that, the area would be evacuated. The military would be called in. Yet this happens every single day for a child when they have alcoholic or abusive or this or that parent. Every single day. And nobody does a thing. There's no military evacuation. There's no... a giant just is abusing this baby, I can hear it next door. No. That's just growing up. In our culture, that's just growing up. When I talk about need, and someone says, oh, I don't like needy men, I don't like any of that, a very major part that I'm not willing to throw to the garbage heap and betray just because everyone else has is slapped in the face. It doesn't make any sense. It's not intelligent, kind, scientific, empathic. But I hear women right and left in America talking about how disgusting those needy men are. Maybe they wouldn't be so needy if those needs were met. And that's my focus, basically. You know, I meet women after woman after woman with, see, because it goes both ways. It's this circle. So the women shame my need. I mean, we have to make it really small so we can see the pattern. So my parents betray the sacred trust of parents and betray me in a needy state. Number one, it's evil, it's wrong, everyone tolerates, everyone lies about it. I tried talking to it to numerous spiritual New Agey adults when I was 6, 7, 8, 10. Nobody wants to look at it. No one wants to confront the parent. It's a betrayal. The child is told they're insane, that no, their parents aren't doing that, that they're lucky. Look on the bright side. Please don't tell me there's any pain here that I'm going to have to do something about, because I am terrified of your parents myself, and I do not want to face them. So just please put up with their abuse until you're older. It'll all pass. I don't want to deal with it. So this is the betrayal of the betrayal. When everyone else conspicuously blocks, the person, of course, has, because that's the way trauma works. When you are in a life and death situation, it gets frozen in memory in the brains. We don't have yet the skill and practice of diagnosing trauma in these kind of childhood decisions, which is why I was 40 years old before I even understood what trauma was, or that it was locked in the body after lots of ineffective therapy. Now, then the adult has to go through some of that period. And then they're shamed again with the same hate and hostility of the parent. And when you're regressed, you feel like you're 2 years old. So it's a reliving of the wound. Then you're that much needier for the next woman, until eventually you say, I am so tired of being shamed and abused by people, I'm just going to cut that whole part of me off. So now I have attained the stereotypical sociopathic male state that I'm supposed to be. All men are that way. Why? They're not naturally that way. It's our country, it's our culture, it's barbaric. But anyway, they're supposed to be that way, you're now that way. Now the abuse reverses. Now every woman knows that when she goes into her little girl, when she's desperately needy, when she's insecure, when she's afraid she's not beautiful enough, she absolutely knows that the man is going to tease, humiliate, belittle, be impatient with, be claustrophobic with those feelings in her. So this is the flip. So the woman who hates needy men picks the man who's sociopathic. Then at some stage, if he's a great guy, she gets needy with him, but he's now in a sociopathic state, and kind of get it together. Go talk to your girlfriends. And she's like, I'm sorry. Gosh, I'm so needy. I hate this part of me. And she tries to become sociopathic. Now, if they both succeed, there's total loneliness. No one's there for anyone. Now, having fought hard for this part of myself, having flooded this part with as many met needs as I can possibly give it, and being a successful entrepreneur and stuff, I have a lot more freedom. Like, I can go to Thailand and spend a month getting 5-hour-a-day massages and flooding that part, etc. The trouble with trauma is some of it gets locked into timeless parts of the brain. They've shown that there's a measure of time that around traumatic memories, the time measuring stops. So the memory doesn't fade, and it doesn't get you in a new reality. And so there's parts of brain chemistry that I'm still learning, that we are still learning as a culture. And I want to really emphasize that while I may be unique in talking about this thing, the statistics are in that roughly a third of Americans are in varying degrees and levels of what I'm talking about. Varying degrees of coping, varying degrees of feeling this, varying degrees of it happening, varying degrees of debilitation, varying degrees of loneliness, varying degrees of insanity, varying degrees of addiction to manage the pain, whether it's addiction to work or addiction to food or sugar or coffee, it doesn't matter. It's coping with an intense pain. Americans are one of the most shame-based cultures on the planet. I travel around. You won't find anyone apologizing in a terrified state for having emotions when someone loses it and they come up, as much as Americans will. And that tells you how much that part is partitioned off and how scared we are as a culture of it coming back. That's lonely. I can't tell you how many women around me as a vulnerable, honest, direct, good communicating man will be brought, despite their best efforts, into an emotional state. Heaven forbid they actually feel something, but brought into an emotional state, burst into tears before they figure out what's happening and can control it. And their immediate response is like, I'm like, great, hello, you've arrived. You're here now. You've just vacated the sociopathic state. You've come from your reptilian brain. You're now up in your human brain. Hooray, welcome to the human race. This is your birthright, your feelings. And yes, the first wave is grief and pain and sorrow. That's the first wave. That's what was going on when you left your emotional state. But it's not who you are, and it's not all the feelings there. There's joy and happiness and excitement, but you got to cry through those tears, and you need some care and love. And I'm here. I'm here. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that this doesn't normally happen to me. I don't normally have these feelings. I better go. I better go. No. This is great. I'm not shaming you. I'm not attacking you. I'm not in a hurry. This is important. This is human stuff. No, I can't do that. And they literally fight their way to the door, run off, and most of them avoid me like the plague from that point, which is yet one more form of loneliness. Because they're right on the edge of a breakthrough, but they've been so battered by the men in sociopathic states who have learned that, by all the women who hate their needs, that and all the stereotype of what a cool guy is and isn't, that they can't even believe that someone would actually be interested, without being paid hundreds of dollars an hour, to be there with them for their feelings. And that kindness that I feel, knowing how painful that is and not wanting any human being to be in that state, is not seen, is not trusted, and is often judged like, that guy, I don't know what it is about him, but I don't normally feel these feelings. There's something off about him. And I'll find myself actually judged and attacked and avoided because I had the audacity to make space for deep feelings that they thought they had under control. But under control is not healed, is not integrated, is not honored, is not healthy. Under control is lonely. That just means the lock on the door for those parts of yourself that have been shut out of consciousness is so heavy that you're pretty confident that those terrified, needy, wounded parts that you blockaded or that were shoved away from you and that you internalized and reinforced the lock can't come in and ruin your day. And that's the attitude. They are ruining my day. Not we are ruining their day. Not we in this culture have kept parts of our psyche on a starvation diet in dark rooms with shame and terror and no company and no love and no hope of it. For decades, we have ruined the lifetime for these parts of us in insanely cruel ways. And then we are enraged at these parts of ourselves when they have the audacity to show up once or twice. It's like, don't you see I'm in a meeting? Don't you see this? There's no space for them. That's loneliness. For them, it's loneliness. And when some part of us knows this is not what it's like to be human, this was not how it was meant to be. To grow as human and spiritual beings, it's about transcending this. It's about saying, I'm not playing along with this bullshit. Let's be real. Let's be human beings. But that means, in a certain sense, outsmarting the culture. You know, like I've played the cultural game to be able to make a lot of money per hour, specifically so that I can take 80% of my time is not working. So that, because I get no support, I mean, there's no institutional support or anything like that for going AWOL with the culture. I don't want more money. I want the freedom to live a rich life. And going into that terrain is lonely. Meaning, in the US, like I'm in Thailand, because I can have rich interactions within the Thai cultural framework, which is much more suited for that than I can in my own place. I do not know a single American that I can call up who loves their inner child and welcomes all their feelings and is willing to sit and cry with me or sit and be cried with or have a hug or play and go on the full spontaneous journey for a week. Let's just do that for a week and see where it goes and become new human beings in a certain way. Let's welcome back those taboo parts. I have not found someone to do that for a week in years. And I'd love to do it every month. Let's play for a week. Let's play for a week, at least every month. It's only 25% of the time. 25% of the time to actually be real and have all that part come back home. Be welcome, be honored, and be safe. Because when you've been locked up in a dark room, in shame and in terror with memories of beatings for 30 years, separated from the rest of the self with dissociation, because that part is so terrified that if it comes back, it'll happen again. You don't want a begrudging, see, because those parts won't come out of those dark places with a begrudging sneer like, you better behave, I'll tolerate you. No, it needs lots of love, lots of care, lots of courage, lots of maturity to say, this is shit. I am so sorry I went along with that crap. I did the best I could, but you did not deserve to be banished for decades for the convenience of two juvenile parents who shouldn't have had children if they weren't willing to stand up for the rights of those children. That is pathetic. And I'm sorry I had to go along with all these years. You need love. You need pampering. It's time for me to make it up to you, play with you, and love you, and care for you. And I'm going to do that. I am going to do that. If everyone else is too crazy, still hiding and locking up their own selves and are terrified that I'm going AWOL, fine. We're doing it alone. We're going to find some place for you in this world, some place, sometime where you are welcome, because you deserve that. Because here's one of the most lonely parts in this whole environment. Because I'm talking about myself, but I'm talking about myself because I see it in so many. We're not that different as human beings. We express who we are differently, but we're not that different. We all have the same feelings. We all have the same needs. We all have the same potential, and we all have the same essentially good nature. The nature of a rose or of any sick plant that when put into good soil with good water does not need coaching, does not need beatings, does not need money, does not need anything to incentivize it to grow. You take any sick plant in a sick environment and you move it into a healthy environment. And if it's not too late, it will recover on its own, from its own essential nature, from the core essence to want to be its best and its full self. And it'll unfortunately recover faster than most humans because it doesn't have a brain that's judging all the recovery. Oh my God, those leaves are growing back. I thought I cut those off. Gosh, let me get out my self-shearing and cut those back off again. Oh gosh, and that's not look. The plant doesn't have that, so it'll grow back in a month. And I frequently rescue plants in my business, and it's like you give a plant the right condition, it will thrive, and it won't shame itself. It won't apologize. It'll just thrive. Human beings, you got to bring it into a good condition, and you've got to start restructuring all those internalized shaming and critical crap that is stopping the recovery, and comes back. And it is just as amazing. I've watched people in abuse situations, not a single safe person their entire life for decades. And in a matter of months, if they've got that help to redo their brain that's shaming themselves, because everyone internalizes the abuser. When the only way you survived was by going along the abuse, you internalize the abuser. So then you start to recover, and the abuser starts to whack you down again. So first you need to be in the environment that is actually safe and healthy, and then you've got to, thought by thought, no. You're not bad for interrupting and speaking. What was bad is the fact that you were hit every single time you spoke for the first 8 years of your life. That's what's bad. Let's get that off. And it takes work. It's, those internalized abusers are deep. They're repetitive. They're persistent because they've kept you alive. They're deep. That takes work, but the actual recovery, when you get it, and when you're right there and catch it, and you watch someone's eyes go into, shame and terror or regression, and you're right there. Okay, let's be with it. How old are you right now? What's happening in those memories? What are you afraid of? Let's go into that imagery and let's get that abusive brother, that abusive sister, that shaming church, that whacking teacher, that insane, this. Let's get that off of you. And now you can be yourself. Now you can be yourself. That's beautiful. And you can see transcendence in an hour. I led someone the other day. She'd been blocking her breath since she was 7 years old in these little shallow breaths because there was so much pain in there. And I asked her to breathe, and she couldn't. She wouldn't. So I knew, we got emotion there. There's a big well of emotion. So I said, what do you need to be safe enough to breathe deeply? Presence, care, trust that I wouldn't laugh or diminish the feelings in any way, trust that there was no hurry, hand-holding, love, and a welcoming of anything that came up. Within 5 deep breaths, the whole flood of emotion comes through. You hold, welcome, honor the emotion. And feelings that have been banished and thus alone for decades are welcomed back into the self and then released in 5, 10, 20 minutes. But when you don't have a single safe person able to do that, your entire life, you can die with those feelings in prison. It's a wound. It doesn't just take care of itself. You just get sicker, and more of your energy goes into keeping that stuff in prison. So this is all part of this terrain of loneliness. The loneliness of some part of you wanting to grow, some part of you wanting a way out, and never having a single way ever to do that, never having the safety. And for trauma and shame, you need help. Ideally from human beings, but definitely from some consciousness you trust fully, bigger than yourself. And unfortunately, whether it's the Christian God, like my parents read me the Old Testament, my father would kind of pretend to be God, and he'd read about the God sending his children out into the desert for 40 years just to test them and waste their time, or cutting, will you cut your son in half to prove your loyalty? And it's like, okay, you raised the sword and you were willing, now you're faithful. In other words, to the child, you're completely dispensable. What matters is God is so demanding in absolute obedience, just like parents, that if you're not willing to kill your own child because God tells you to, you're not good enough. And that's, you can't trust a consciousness like that when you're in absolute terror and life-threatening trauma. That's exactly the thing you should be terrified of, is any human being or presence who's that barbaric. But there are consciousness. There are consciousness. And this has actually been, I would not have healed from some of this. I mean, the level of lies, the depth and the persistence of abuse and lies within the culture is so thick. Though some parts of me are never going to trust another human being, period. Because not one human being has shown up for those parts in their whole life. They've watched one adult after another choose to look the other way and let the abuse continue, rather than have courage to confront and face their own terror of going head to head with an abusive parent or an abusive adult. Or to honor, as is often the case just as much, that, wow, if that's how this child is feeling, I wonder how my child is feeling, because I do that sometimes to my child, and I don't want to look at that. I want to be the progressive great parent who just bought their kid a flat screen TV that should make it all okay. Aren't you lucky? Material has nothing to do with this. Materialism, completely different worlds. You traumatize and hurt your child, buy them a car. Sure, their materialistic mind may accept the car and even believe in a materialistic culture that they're okay. But the suppressed emotions that have been sent off into the hinterlands and the shadow, they could care shit about a car. What they're interested in is it safe to come back, or will they be beaten, raped, whatever, again? So this is the kind of terrain of loneliness that we all deal with to certain degrees, and the healing is as effective as the abuse. But I'll just look at a couple of other areas that may touch you so you have a sense. So loneliness is dancing in a crowded room when most people look away as if there's something ugly or scary about you when you make eye contact. It's something I experienced as a young man. If I smile and am present and I'm dancing and stuff, the men need to kind of send you a glare or whatever to make sure you know they're not gay. The women, it's like, I'm not available, or I'm not interested. It's like, it's a smile, it's a joy. But that part is not welcome. Joy and innocence, blocked. Loneliness is telling the truth 100% of the time to friends and lovers and being told that everyone is a liar. Again, I talked about that. Loneliness is wanting to play with children in the park and knowing that if I put my attention on any child I don't know well for more than about 10 seconds, I will be treated and assumed to be a pedophile. When, again, it's the most beautiful part in me that is willing to throw away all the cultural crap about what men are supposed to be and how useless children are supposed to be until they're really smart, and actually knows that a 2-year-old is far more intelligent and engaging in terms of being still present with their feelings than most adults are. So I love kids, and yet I'm viewed with suspicion when I try to connect. Not in Thailand. I love that. I can play with children here for hours. Loneliness is trying your very hardest to do something and failing, while other people assume you could easily do it and are just lazy. The heartbreak of dyslexics who are told that they just need to try a little harder when they're when they can't read. They were brilliant, excited, they thought they were wonderful like everyone else, and then reading comes around and there's something about that they can't do. And yet so many of the brilliant entrepreneurs are dyslexic. I had some of that. It's giving your whole heart and soul to do something, not having that seen, not having your obstacles seen. I was also hyper because of the abuse. See, when someone is really hyper, it's saying something. I'm in a panic. I'm in a panic. And that's saying something. Some part of me is not safe. And that's saying something. There's something in the environment that's not safe. And that's saying something. It's saying that the community and the parents are not doing their job. But that is a very unpopular message. A very unpopular message. So it's put on the kid. You have a learning disability. Not we have an environmental disability. You have a learning disability. It's shamed, and it's heartbreaking. Loneliness is desperately wanting to connect with someone in a safe and sane way in which all feelings are welcome, that's really seeing you, but saying no thank you to one connection after another because it's not that kind of connection. It's, hey, how about a drink for 10, 20 minutes and talk about this, but don't you dare bring in any emotions. So when you want nothing more than to have a really safe, good friend, and instead you're invited into one context after another where all truth and depth is taboo, and so you've got to say no to the people who you would love to have those deep conversations with, but they don't want them. Loneliness is that divide. I really want to connect with someone in this way, but I've got to say I've got to say no to all these things because I'm saner and more connected with myself in my journal than I am talking about sports when I'm conscious of these feelings in myself and often in you. Loneliness is realizing that even if someone does take this time to understand the pain or hear that you are in pain because of X, Y, Z and gets that X, Y, and Z is happening, that dovetails into a little side note around loneliness, around not being seen. Many of us have noticed, or would notice if we did the time to examine, that in a certain environment, from a certain angle, or in a certain condition, or a certain timing, that we are geniuses in a certain specific area. You know, one of my best relationships of all time was with a much older woman, and her genius was that she made everyone feel safe. Everyone just opened up with her. But it had to be for her to be herself or feel safe in that space. Things had to be at a certain pace, not too crowded, not too rushed, not too heady, etc. And so I think one of the areas in a very narrow arena of the culture, and as one of my authors, Terence McKenna, often says, is culture is not your friend, meaning that the culture doesn't care about you individually. It doesn't care what makes you happy or makes you sad. It doesn't care what brings out the best in you or what brings out the worst in you. What culture cares about is continuing the status quo in a way that allows a majority of people to know the rules and interact without too much thought, so that the cultural predominating values and traditions can continue with minimal interference. And in the United States, in all of my travelings around the world, I have never seen a place as wonderful as the United States for making and spending money. They may be out there, but I have not come across that. And so if it's dovetailing in that line, it's all working. But this gets into an area of loneliness. Many of us have a gift or a talent that wants to come out, but it's the equivalent of let's say, a 2-inch shape that has to go through a mesh that's like a 1/2-inch square, like hardware fabric. And this shape is never going to fit through that mesh. And what every culture and tradition has is a mesh. And it's designed as a filter, like an immune system, to keep everything foreign out. But it is not a conscientious, a humane, a compassionate, or a conscious immune system. It is an unconscious immune system held in place by a pain-pleasure algorithm that punishes everyone that steps outside of the mesh that is the culture and rewards everyone that adheres to it. And the consequence of this arbitrary mesh, meaning you're born into a specific culture. There have been 10,000 cultures through, and 10,000 languages, only of which only roughly 600 remain on the planet today, and they're dying out. In that context, every culture has had a mesh. This has a mesh. This culture has a mesh. And there's a variety of elements. So there's mesh around frequency. There's mesh around what's appropriate. There's mesh around stereotypes. There's mesh around legal systems. There's mesh around value hierarchy. It's fine to have fun, but only after you've made your first million, or otherwise you're a loser, or whatever it is. Okay, it's fine to go off and drift into space, but only if you're Steve Jobs and you're doing it in your Zen meditation. It's otherwise you're woo-woo. Whatever the mesh is, in whatever aspect of the culture, when your gift and your essence doesn't fit through the mesh, when it is rejected, blocked, denied, ignored, humiliated, derided, for no other reason than that it doesn't fit through the cultural mesh, you will feel lonely. And I was thinking a little bit about that because the mesh is also the technology. For example, this phone, which I'm using to record the Samsung Note 5, continuously records up to 3.5 hours with 64 gigs without pausing. The Note 3 before it, every time it hit 33 minutes, its maximum file size, it just stopped, breaking the flow. That little bit of technology and my awareness of 33 minutes coming up and the pause changed my entire thought pattern, and the way I was able to communicate was limited to the technology. The reality of this break, the ripple effects of technology and environment really affect things. And when we know that something important within us that wants to come out is being blocked by an unconscious setup that doesn't see or acknowledge that force, there is a sense of loneliness, of sometimes desperation, because many of us have the experience that what most wants to come out has gone this way and this way and this way and this way. It's tried this one from this angle, from this thing. And there's just one thing after another, seemingly unconscious, but it all adds up to the same thing. Who you are, your beauty, your gift, your talent, your sense that there's something more there, remains invisible, remains unwanted, remains unconsidered, remains disrespected, interrupted, ignored, blocked in 1,000 different ways that stop your most valuable contribution from coming out in some form. When this is the case, there is invisibility and there will be a feeling of loneliness. I want to close by talking about, and kind of what brought that up was the fact that for me, threads of thought are tenuous. Like I can go for hours when I'm in a flow, but one interruption and I've lost it. And sometimes the entire thing has to be abandoned because where I pick off can't be reconnected with it. And that's just the way I'm built. But when nobody understands that and interrupts things as if thought patterns can just be paused and play because they'd like them to be, and a month's work is just lost because someone didn't see, and someone didn't know they didn't see, and someone didn't bother to ask, and someone can't imagine, and I don't have control of what everyone is going to do around me, and I see those just deadening drains of possibility, and there's nothing I feel I can do about it. There's a loneliness, there's a helplessness, and there's an awareness that even if I could make that person understand that what they just did just cost me the most valuable thing all week for me, I'm not sure I'd want to, because I don't want to make them feel bad. And many people can't hold those nuances of complex things in their mind, and so they're not going to change anyway. But there's loneliness there. And this little interruption with the battery and stuff is a little part of it. The place that I want to kind of conclude with is that for many of us, there is a loneliness of being part of a given relationship, a given family, a given group, in which we are absolutely clear that the rules of that group is that some part of us that we know is there and that is important is not only not wanted and welcome, but that we would not be accepted and, quote, loved if people knew that that part of us was a valued part of who we are, one, or two, a part of ourselves that we know is there, but whether we like it or not, we can't differentiate from that. And kind of here's some examples of what I mean. I've never fit well in any group. So if I'm with Republicans, I'm always seeing the bits that seem kind of excluded from, the positive aspects of some of the democratic values. Or if I'm with the Democrats, I'm looking at what completes the picture, what brings the most well-being in the most efficient and intelligent way, independent of dogma. So in any group, there's a tendency for cliquishness and dogma. And it doesn't matter if you're in the New Age group, complaining about the traditionalists, or the traditionalists spoofing the New Agers, or the independents and, what's that group that libertarians, whatever it is, there's usually something missing that would create well-being in my experience in travels, and then there's also there's those cultural generalities, etc. And because I have many sides, I have a choice. I have a choice of which side of me to emphasize and present. And there is never enough time to present the entire thought process. And so it's very easy to be a leader or a hero or, embody all these kind of archetypal values within a given group. But it's equally easy to be the enemy. And for me, there's loneliness in knowing that the only reason I am admired, respected, liked in a group is because they don't know the other half of the story, that they don't want to know there is another half of the story, and that if I bring that part up, I will immediately flip, lose status, and go down. And this is lonely because all sides of those stories for me have something to do with well-being. The reason I am loyal to all those different perspectives in myself and those different ingredients and those different aspects is because I find all of them bring some aspect of well-being to me. Like it's the innocent child in me that is so denigrated in serious circles that brings me the most vitality and energy. It is the part of me that is completely unproductive and can just sit and lay and watch podcasts for 3 or 4 days straight and synthesize a lot of ideas and get a sense of where I am in all of that. That then leads to other parts that people find very incisive and articulate. It's the incredibly busy and focused and productive and at times very ruthless part of me in getting things done and saying no to things that allows me to make enormous amount of money in a very short amount of time so that I can turn around and flip that freedom into spending the majority of my time doing the exact opposite, which is being completely spontaneous and unfocused and having an idea on a motorbike this morning, jotting it down, writing a list of a possible book on loneliness, then listening to a podcast, then deciding I would turn the book into a video, then questioning that, then deciding, yes, I will do that, and then, sitting down for 2 hours at 5 minutes notice and making this podcast. And that flexibility is purchased by its exact opposite. It's purchased by the incredible focused thought and 25 years of refining this algorithm to make the most amount of money in the least amount of minutes, so that I have the most amount of freedom to do the opposite. And the very fact that so many of these parts are paradoxical, the fact that I have picked up bits and pieces from a huge range of sources and biographies and added, and then and the fact that the most self-centered parts of me are the parts of me that analyze myself in enough detail to understand others with the same nuance. And yet it is the self-centered part of me that gets some of the biggest hits, some of the biggest judgment, as the one part is seen without its connection to going back. In other words, when self-centeredness is observed in its stage of self-centeredness, it's attacked. But when it's observed in its result of profound generosity and empathy, it is rewarded. It's much like a fussy housewife or anyone who fusses over the rose as this most beautiful thing, but that curses the root that grew the rose as being too dirty, too disgusting to want anything to do with, that doesn't want to water the root and till the soil, but wants to fuss over and spray little fertilizer things on the flower. But spraying fertilizer and fussing with the flower does not produce a great rose. Manure, dark, rich soil, and that fragrant smell and tending the root lets the plant create a rose on its own. When I'm aware that I'm in a narrow group, which is almost always, meaning I've only had 1 or 2 experiences in my whole life where I've had the sense that a given individual or I don't think there's ever been a group really sees the full circle. And in the even rarer moments when I have the sense that that full circle is welcome. There's a couple different things to do to block and to respond to the loneliness of knowing that I'm accepted only for this. One of the things I do is play devil's advocate, where wherever I am, I bring in the unexpressed, part of the group, the unexpressed thing that isn't naturally included there, and then see if anyone at all accepts and rejects that, and just take that, whatever part of me is most hated within the group is really the level of love and acceptance there, and kind of get it over with, so rather than feeding too much on all the praise and all of that, let's just bring in the most unpopular part of me within that particular group. And if that's accepted, then there's a real, it heals loneliness. But if not, at least I don't have the loneliness of knowing that the only reason I'm liked is because I'm not bringing a part forward. Another thing that I do with loneliness, and so I'm kind of transitioning as we go out with what are some of the things that I've done and that can be done to heal loneliness. Because within the, when we don't heal one mental, emotional, or physical disease, when we let it linger, when we don't treat it with respect and take it seriously, we get what's called co-infections. It's like if we don't heal the cold and then we go out and then we get pneumonia, and if we don't heal that, we get this and that, and the weakened state makes it that much easier to catch the next thing. So from loneliness, it's very easy to catch pain and fear and shame in this culture, and then it's easy to catch depression and this and that and the other, and it can just get thick. So how to respond? I'd say, in this case, with loneliness, go to the core of it. And for me, it's very important to take control of the environment. Given that loneliness is often about individuals and relationships, I specifically ask people, if they're interested in having a relationship with me, to sit down and have a series of conversations about what love looks like, what pain looks like, what patterns we're trying to create for ourselves in our next relationships, what a good friend is for each of us, what expectations we can have of one another, what communication protocols work for both of us. For example, it doesn't work for me to write a nice, courteous email for 3 or 4 pages and have someone respond maybe next week. I want a serious dialogue, and I want to engage with people that have that level of interest and will create the time for it. And so have those conversations, and that's kind of basic level one. It's not saying we're going to be compatible when we have all those conversations, but we won't be alone, and we won't be making projections and assumptions. So if we see that you want to communicate once a month and I want to communicate once a week, that you like talking about this and I like talking about this, and you hate Indian food and I love it, and you like to schedule things 2 weeks in advance, I like to have spontaneous calls, we're not alone. We see each other, and we can say with great respect and appreciation, you're who you are, I'm who I am, thank you for this conversation, and let's disengage. Or with someone else, we can say we got a 30% area of overlap here. Let's focus in here and be partners to co-create something. This heals loneliness beautifully. It's very effective. And the biggest loneliness is that in a culture that has not developed the science of relating to the same degree as the science of building an iPad, and I think relating is more important, many people don't get it. They're not willing to take the time, and they don't understand why anyone would want to. that's an area I feel alone. So that in and of itself is a good basis to separate. Two, there are areas where human beings are just not the best at loving, seeing, and understanding things. And so developing a relationship, first of all, having the humility to know that reality is much bigger than we have the ability to perceive. Some of that is faith, some of it is science. They both ultimately converge. And within all that reality of consciousness and multidimensionality and space-time and all that, it's very arrogant to assume that there isn't any consciousness that doesn't have the ability to perceive us, even though we can't fully perceive it, and to have great beneficence and goodwill and unconditional love and well-being and support, and that can nourish and energize us. And so from that vantage point of belief and humility, to open up to being unconditionally loved in a way that no human is capable of. This is a very powerful response. Talking about all this stuff, for example, there is not a single individual tonight that I know anywhere in the world that I could have called up and said all this to. But some part of me wanted to say it, a part of me that doesn't fit into the normal cultural mesh. So creating a container through technology, like my camera, will create space for this, for anything, for up to 3.5 hours. And so that container and technology is very, very important. You know, writing an email to yourself and then replying, writing appreciations to yourself for all the things that are not appreciated. It's like if there's some part that wants appreciation and 99.9% of people don't get it, don't want to get it, and even if they do, they don't like the idea of appreciating it, and even if they think the appreciation, they won't tell you, and you need verbal appreciation to get it, write appreciation to yourself. And finally, with those close intimates, coach them on how to love you in those lonely areas. So I coach my partner and say things like, you know, receiving a nice card with this kind of thing, and it really helps me feel special. How does that work for you? Oh, it's one of her favorite things to do is make those cards and draw them. She loves drawing and stuff like that. Well, now it's a win-win. I mean, she loves giving, she loves doing art, she's got an abundance of joy and time around that, and it touches my heart. So it's a win-win. But it's our job with those people willing to ask for what we need and want most, and to learn the recipes for that. A good exercise for this is make a list of 30 things that almost anyone could do that if and when they do it has a high probability of making you feel completely and totally loved. And you can get into great detail. It's a technique called scripting. And it's also valuable to find books, audiobooks, Audible, YouTube videos by people who are honoring the part in themselves that is not being honored by those around you in you, or even honored by yourself in you. That is, and can be extremely healing and medicinal, and it's just so beautiful how we have access to millions of hours of some of the greatest teachers and thinkers in the world for free on YouTube. And with YouTube Red, for $10 a month, I don't see any ads on anything. They don't really promote that part, but once you get all the free music videos, unlimited, you get ad-free YouTube, period, which is, again, a huge deal for a mind that works like mine. So these are some of the medicines to loneliness. The scientific method in medicine and healing needs to be accurate diagnosis. So what's the intensity of the disease and what is the disease? So which parts of me are feeling what degree of loneliness? And if it's unknown and there's just this vague feeling of loneliness, i.e. some of those internalized selves are banished so deeply that I don't even know what they are, then it's a scientific exploration. I did a very extensive scientific exploration where I took 1 year to do everything on my bucket list, and set aside a budget to do that. And I just basically tried everything that had any possibility of being fun and some very dubious things, and then counted the amount of dollars it took, the amount of time it took, and any other cost, and then the amount of benefit, in this case to healing loneliness, and how long the benefit lasted for, so that you get an equation of, I can go to therapy, it takes X time to drive there, X time to come back, X amount of gas, X, $300 per session. It's a 1 hour, it's a 2 hour session. It takes that amount of time off work. It's this, that, the other. I don't like the drive. The therapist is good in this area, but terrible in that area. X amount of well-being is created. It lasts this long. So I've got a 4 hour window of time. I've got $300. Now, is there any way at all that I could spend that $300 in 4 hours to heal loneliness much more effectively? You can get really creative. What if you stand on the street and give away dollar bills, 300 of them, and see how many jokes, smiles, laughs it is? No gas, no irritating regurgitation of some of the same stuff if you've done a lot of therapy like I have, and you've surprised and you've broken a mold, and see your mind, like if you do that, see, and this is where the power of the question is, because I'd never thought of that. That just popped in when I mentioned the $300 and stuff, because I did it right here. Every time you do this question, this ritual of what's all the ways that I can treat this dis-ease, and there's nothing shameful about it, and it's almost always environmentally. It's almost always environmental. Meaning people do not get sick mentally and emotionally in 99.9% of cases without a sick environment. So it's nothing for you to be ashamed of. It's the culture, if anything, that ought to be like, come on, guys, is this really the best culture we can create for humanity, and peak experience and vitality and mental, emotional, physical health? Or do we just want to be slaves to a corporate ethic that's become tradition and work 9 to 5? I mean, give me a break. But that aside, you ask the question and you do the due diligence. And you do this and this, and it created this. And it lasted this long. Now I'm going to try this, and I'm going to experiment. So $300 given away. Same money, smiling faces. Maybe there's a phone number. Who knows what would happen? Like, I don't know. I went to a party once and set up a magical umbrella on a table with a roving kind of rainbow light behind it. I brought my favorite juice blends of fresh frozen blueberries and this and that, and I created temperature mixes of mango juice and papaya juice and lemon essence and this and that and the other, and the best raw chocolate. It costs about $30-40 in ingredients. And all evening I sat there in a fun outfit, just showed up and did it. No official anything, a spur of the moment. And every single person I said, do a gratitude exercise. Like, tell me the thing you are most grateful for. Close your eyes, open your mouth, and I'll pour you an elixir. And it was a sacrament of gratitude. And seeing the faces of people going away and stuff like that, and realizing that this was fun, I was making connections, and this was a part of me that until I came up with that way of expressing it, had no home in the culture. Like if I just told people I want to give sacred sacrament and see people in a peak state, and that's what I want to do, that's the most important thing I can do today, how can I do it? Everyone would give me a blank look. It's like, go to church? It's like, no, that's the last thing that makes me feel that way. Just I don't know, we've got to go to work, it doesn't fit. But in this way, that part got a space to fit. And so I repeated it and calculated how much well-being and joy it brought to other people. I calculated how much joy and well-being it brought to me. I calculated that it was $30, and I calculated that that was 10 times more joy and well-being than a therapy session. That's scientific economics. That's intelligent. You don't buy a stock for $300 when you could buy the same value stock for 10 cents. You go broke. But people do that all the time. We don't apply this platform. So these are some of the disciplines, and just knowing we're treating a disease, it's important. It's the only thing that will allow us to ultimately give our gifts. It's fun to treat a disease, because of course the best treatment for loneliness is visibility, self-expression, self-acceptance, self-love, belonging, creativity, discovering all those hidden parts, loving them enough to bring them home, stopping wasting the energy banishing them, and getting rid of those people and things in our life that can't accept who we are. With compassion that it's going to take time, and there are very few people in many cultures that can see and accept all of who we are. But we've got to lead the way. We've got to lead the way by accepting who we are, by seeing who we are, by having the courage to see those shriveled, lonely, shamed corpses laying in that room that are a few breaths away from death, and saying, there's nothing ugly about you. What's ugly is the culture that shoved you off into this room. There's nothing ugly about battered, abused, and raped children. What's ugly is a culture that allows battering, rape, and abuse to happen to innocent and vulnerable, beautiful beings before they have any capacity to defend themselves. That's what's ugly. And every single bit in the shadow that's been tucked away had a beautiful core at one point. And when it's given a space, when it's allowed to grow healthy, then we will see it. When you see those scared faces and stuff in there, the tendency can be to become the abuser and say, that's why you're there, is because you're so scared. No, they're so scared because they're there. When we bring them back, they are the most beautiful and vibrant parts of who we are. But you take any magnificent, healthy human being and you lock them in a bunker, shout at them, shame them, beat them, and deny all emotion, and leave them there for a decade, and they will look terrible when you bring them out. But it's not them. It's not innate. It's a sick rose that's been put in the shade. It's a healthy rose that's been put in the shade and becomes sickly. You bring it back out, it becomes beautiful. Thank you for listening to me, if you've made it this far. Thank you for caring enough about me, about our mental, emotional health, about your essence and your emotional health. It's the most vital thing that I know for the many Western diseases, is taking this stuff seriously. So thank you. Thank you very much for doing that. And I'm going to go to bed.